Hi, welcome to Class 2 of the Vietnam War History 3322. And today we'll pick up where we left off last week, continue talking about Ho Chi Minh and the emergence of modern Vietnamese nationalism, and then shift gears a little bit and start talking about the United States, but do a fairly deep background into U.S. foreign policy too, so that when it comes time to spend a good deal of time on the U.S. war in Vietnam, which of course is going to be the body of this course, we'll have some sense of the background and how both Vietnam and Vietnamese and American history interacted at this historical moment in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Okay. Again, like last week, I'll work off the web page as much as possible. I've kind of tweaked it a little bit, so now for the outlines you can go straight to an index of them and go to the one that you want and go back and forth. At the end of class last week, we were talking about the emergence of Ho Chi Minh, who was known by many aliases, including at one point Nguyen Ai Quoc, and there's Ho as a young man, and we'll have images of him intermittently as he ages and becomes a player on the world scene. Ho Chi Minh is really a dynamic and very controversial figure in Vietnamese history. If anybody has followed the news just over the past 6 months to a year, even today Ho Chi Minh can really arouse great passions in California. Earlier this year there was a case of a Vietnamese shopkeeper who owned a video store who had gone to Vietnam and come back and put a picture of Ho Chi Minh up in his store and became the target of protest within the Vietnamese community in Orange County. They were in fact, he was assaulted at one point. So Ho Chi Minh, to many, is the George Washington or the Joan of Arc of his country, the founding father, a great man. And to others, he's the enemy, the threat, the person who sold out Vietnam. So even today, he's still a critical figure in Vietnamese history, clearly the dominant figure in Vietnamese history, certainly in modern Vietnamese history. We talked a little bit about his background last week as a child, his father, how he grew up in a home in which his father was a civil servant who was imbued with nationalist spirits, how Ho Chi Minh, Nguyen Ai Quoc as a young man, heard Phan Boi Chau's poetry, nationalist poetry. In the World War I years, he was kind of an expatriate. He was a merchant seaman for a while, apparently spent time in New York City and London, but settled, as many Asian and especially Vietnamese expatriates did, in Paris. In late 1917, he went to Paris, where he becomes a member of the French Communist Party, the PCF, Parti Communiste Français. With other Vietnamese nationalists, young Vietnamese, he draws up a program for Vietnamese independence. As legend has it, Nguyen Ai Quoc, Nguyen the Patriot, rents a tuxedo and goes to the peace conference at Versailles, where he tries to get in to see Woodrow Wilson. Wilson has been talking about anti-colonialism, and young Ho Chi Minh, fairly young, he was born in 1890, so he's not quite 30. Ho Chi Minh, Nguyen Ai Quoc, tries to get in to see Wilson to tell him about the Vietnamese situation. At that point, he becomes a player within the international communist movement after the World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, spends time in Moscow, where he catches the attention of the Comintern, the Communist International Movement, and he's appointed to go to China to organize something called the League of East Asian Oppressed Peoples. This is a group which is going to be dedicated to a revolution throughout Asia. The Bolsheviks' communism is intended to move outside of Europe into other areas, so they appoint various ministers and commissars to go around the world spreading the doctrine. If you've ever seen the movie Reds, there's a scene where John Reed is actually speaking in the Middle East with the Bolsheviks, and Ho is their appointee to China. Vietnamese, it's kind of ironic. You'll see many weird twists and turns, especially when you're talking about Ho Chi Minh, who's a brilliant strategist and goes through incredible contortions throughout his career. The Vietnamese had some interesting relationships. Vietnamese nationalists had some interesting relationships in China. Many of the Vietnamese in China had been training at a place called the Whampoa Military Academy, which had been organized by Sun Yat-sen in Canton. And in fact, at Whampoa, Ho Chi Minh and the Vietnamese came into contact with people like Zhou Enlai and Chiang Kai-shek, Zhang Jieshi, who would later be blood rivals in the Chinese Civil War. So Ho really knew everyone in the Asian liberation movements of the 20s and 30s. He was a player, and Canton became the Asian capital for Vietnamese dissidents. Just as many Vietnamese expatriates ended up in Paris, many ended up in Canton, China. While in China, Ho really got a practical education. He began to learn Marxist theory, but even more than that, Ho kind of understood what it was like to fight for national liberation, to become a revolutionary. His major biographer, probably still the best biography of him, was written by a French political scientist. It was published probably 30 years ago now, Jean Lacouture. And Lacouture said that while he was in China, Ho began a practical course in political philosophy, and he behaved in the general manner of a secular saint, chopping wood, stopping the barber from beating his wife, and feeding a little boy. He played a role that was part Buddha and part Lenin in Finland. And I cite this quote from Lacouture because this really plays into the persona Ho would use time and again, which was Uncle Ho. We talked last week about how important the family structure was to the Vietnamese. And Ho really was very adept at this. As I said, he was a very small man and, dressed very plainly. He would often be pictured with children or with flowers around his neck. So this is part of it, this role of a secular saint, as Lacouture says. Yeah.
Forgive me if you went over this in the last 30 minutes of the last class, but did he ever marry himself and have kids of his own?
He was never married, and I don't know of any children. There may be some, or like anybody that, but he was never married. No, he died single. He was the father of his country. He didn't have time for personal things like that. He was on the run a lot too. I mean, it would have been probably nearly impossible for him to have any kind of personal relationship for about 30 years, where he was literally one step ahead of the posse most of that time. But this really does play into the Uncle Ho persona. He may not have his own family, but he's clearly, quite seriously, the father of the country there. So he has great authority and great credibility, too, great moral authority among the Vietnamese dissidents, among the Vietnamese expatriates. He immediately stands out, quite intelligent, just a real sense of an intuitive knowledge of what to do at any certain time, which really you can't explain. I mean, you'll see this time and again how he's always skirting on the edge of disaster, but, comes out of it. He emerges from it. It's almost like a cartoon character. The boulder's coming down. He's on the edge of a cliff, and he somehow always escapes. He's kind of like the road runner in that regard. While in China as well, Ho Chi Minh, still going by the name Nguyen Ai Quoc, by the way, and his comrades establish, they turn toward communism as well, and they establish something called the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. All of these things are kind of part of the same time period, the same process. And that's why I say nationalism and communism. Ho Chi Minh was clearly a nationalist, and that was national liberation was clearly the key to his independence movement for a half century, really. But he also found Marxist philosophy quite appealing, communist organizations in Moscow and China. So in 1930, he and his comrades formed the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And it's interesting, when there's a debate over what Ho Chi Minh was he a nationalist, was he a communist, as if you have to be one or the other and you can't meld both, which is clearly what he did. The initial founding program of the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is really interesting to kind of speak to this. In it, he appealed to both, quote, the oppressed colonies and the exploited working class. So he's speaking to both issues, the oppressed colonies, the Indo-Chinese, speaking to nationalist liberation, and the oppressed working class, which tends to have a more of a Marxist ideology attached to it, the proletariat. And the platform really kind of goes in both directions, too. Among the points are to overthrow French imperialism and the reactionary Vietnamese capitalist class, the collaborators, to make Indochina completely independent. Okay, so those first two priorities are clearly nationalist. National independence, get rid of the French, but then to establish government composed of workers, peasants, and soldiers, to confiscate the banks and enterprises belonging to the imperialists, to confiscate the whole of the plantations and property belonging to the imperialists and the Vietnamese reactionary class and distribute them to the poor peasants. Land redistribution, land reform, which basically targets you as a revolutionary, as a radical, as a troublemaker. In American history, there's always been a real hostility to land reform. You can see that time and again in the response abroad, or the response at home to things like the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War. When you start taking land away from rich people and giving it to poor people, you're really going over the edge. You're making a lot of people in the capitalist circles very uneasy, and clearly Ho has that in his agenda to implement an 8-hour workday, to abolish public loans and the poll tax, to waive unjust taxes hitting the poor people, to bring back freedom to the masses, to carry out universal education, and to implement equality between men and women, which clearly is a very radical notion in the 1930s, especially in Confucian society. Confucian society tends to be very patriarchal, and Ho Chi Minh is saying, well, men and women should be equal, and he'll talk more about that in the years to come. So the initial program, the founding program of the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, speaks to nationalist issues and communist issues both. And this is something that's going to be consistent with Ho Chi Minh over the course of the next 40 years. He dies in 1969, September 1969, in fact. We're coming up on the 30th anniversary of it. Ho Chi Minh, in fact, at this time, people talk about Ho always being this radical communist. When the ICP was established and this 10-point platform was first announced, Ho really, quite frankly, caught hell from a lot of his comrades in the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. Many of them were upset that Ho was not radical enough, in fact. When he said the Vietnamese resistance should be peasant-led, but he was also willing to allow landholders in, middle-class landlords, people who owned land. He was willing to allow them into the movement as well, so long as they hated the French. So even though it was a communist party, it was to be worker or peasant-led, the only real criteria, the only real objective that Ho Chi Minh had in mind was that you didn't like the French. If you were anti-French, then he was willing to accept you. And a lot of his comrades really were a lot less open-minded or tolerant, if you want to use those terms, than Ho Chi Minh was on this issue. Okay? Immediately, the ICP came under attack. There was a famous, if you want to call it a massacre, in fact, in June of 1930, on June 17th, 1930, 13 members of the Vietnamese Communist Party were guillotined in Yen Bay provincial town, which is north of Hanoi. The French colonial authorities really cracked down upon the Vietnamese communists as soon as the party was established, to the point where they arrested 13 people they considered ringleaders and guillotined them. The fighters, these Vietnamese freedom fighters, had immediately begun, as soon as they started the party, begun conducting attacks, small-scale guerrilla-type attacks on the French. And so the French didn't waste any time in really cracking down on these Vietnamese communists. In fact, the 13 men who were guillotined represented over a third of the party. There were about 37 party members in North Vietnam at the time. So, and Ho isn't. This party is not established in Indochina. Many of the founders of the Vietnamese Communist Party can't step foot in Indochina. Ho Chi Minh was a marked man. I mean, he was, you know, pictured in all the post offices and everything. The French would have had him dead to rights in a minute. So, but in the North, for example, 13 of the 37 were executed. And these executions, I mean, this is just the start. This was called the June 17th movement because it occurred on June 17th. So immediately the party comes under attack from outside, from the French, but also from within, because Ho's associates, Ho's comrades, believe he's not being radical enough. The French repression also is a part of a political movement. This is hard to see because it takes up so much of the screen, but this is Con Son Island, and this is kind of a penal island. Maybe like Robben Island in South Africa, if you're familiar with that, where Mandela was. A lot of the French political prisoners end up here. It's isolated, and it's, as you can see, fairly bleak. And so over the course of the 30s and 40s, a lot of Vietnamese nationalists are going to end up at Con Son and in other prisons, Indo-Chinese prisons. It's actually a wonderful movie on this period, a French film starring Catherine Deneuve called Indochine. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it, but it's visually quite beautiful. The scenes of Vietnam, I think it was filmed in Thailand, are really amazing. But the story is quite accurate historically too. The story of the Vietnamese resistance and how people are put into prison camps and how the French repress any symbol of Vietnamese independence or Vietnamese autonomy. So from without, then, the French are attacking, but internally too, Ho Chi Minh is coming under attack because he's not being as radical or as Marxist as he might be. He's allowing these wealthy peasants or landholders into the movement where a lot of fundamentalist type communists would not. They would have made this solely a party of peasants and workers and maybe the intelligentsia. And Ho was not doctrinaire, and you'll see this time and again in that regard. Ho, who people will see as kind of this incredible radical communist, this tool of Mao Zedong or Joseph Stalin, really was never very doctrinaire, and quite often was under attack from his own group, from his own people. You'll see this pattern repeat itself. As the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, was debating whether it should be a nationalist or a communist movement, and this is something they dealt with for quite some time, the Vietnamese people themselves essentially took action, took the law into their own hands, as it were. One thing, and we talked about this in the early Chinese period, that continues is the idea of spontaneous uprisings, or the equivalent of a wildcat strike. Quite often the people, without any lead from above, will just take to the streets. And this happens time and again, and it happens in 1930. I mean, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is formed, and there's a debate also within that as to what the role of the party will be in national liberation and revolution. A lot of the hardline communists believe that the Indo-Chinese Communist Party, the communists, should lead the revolution. And Ho Chi Minh believed that the communists should simply be a very loyal and large and significant group within the revolution. And so there's a debate upon what the role of the party will be. Well, the people just kind of ignore that, and they take to the streets themselves. So there is often action from below which pressures the communist leadership at the top. And this is something the Americans, and the French and the Americans, never really accepted or understood. Actually, the establishment, we get to 1960, of the National Liberation Front is in large measure a response to pressure from below. And Ho Chi Minh is quite often one of the slow pokes in this. He's often going slow, and the people simply just ignore the leadership and go to the streets. And you see that in 1930 and 31 already. In fact, in 30 and 31, Ho was again in prison. This time he was in Hong Kong. At that time he was going by the alias Tong Van So. I don't think you could actually list all the names he went by at various times. And workers simply took to the streets to protest conditions in Vietnam. There was a depression, of course, in the 1930s. Their wages were low, prices were too high. So they spontaneously went on strike, both in factories and in a cement works, in Haiphong, in a rubber plantation in Saigon, in a textile mill in Nam Dinh, and in other places like that. They also organized strikes and demonstrations throughout the country on May 1st. And the significance of that is it's May Day. It's Labor Day everywhere in the world except for the United States. International Workers' Day. All right? International Labor Day. In northern Annam, in Ho Chi Minh's home province of Nha Tinh, a very serious action took place where peasants and workers actually took over the local government for a time and established Soviets to run Nha Tinh province. So they took over, they reduced rent, they redistributed land until, of course, the French come in and crack down. Now, again, there's another irony talking about Ho Chi Minh. When these spontaneous rebellions occur, when the people go to the streets and have these work stoppages and wildcat strikes and that kind of thing, the French and Ho Chi Minh basically have the same opinion of them, which is we can't tolerate this. The French, of course, didn't want anybody questioning their rule. Ho thought it was way too much, way too soon, that these people were going out on a limb. They didn't have organization. They didn't have any kind of political capital. They certainly didn't have weapons, and they were setting themselves up. So Ho believed that the French would crush these spontaneous movements and damage the entire movement. So neither Ho nor the French were really happy to see these spontaneous uprisings. And Ho, in fact, was right. The French moved in immediately. Local police arrested thousands of Vietnamese nationals who were protesting. Many are sent to Con Son Island. They executed over 80 prisoners, people considered ringleaders of these movements. They handed long, very long prison sentences to over 400, perhaps 500 others. The Indo-Chinese Communist Party estimated that in these spontaneous uprisings in 30 and 31, over 2,000 of their supporters were killed, and over 50,000 were arrested. Okay, including in the arrests were people whose names will become household words in the 50s and 60s. Trong Chinh, who was one of Ho's oldest friends, Pham Van Dong, who was later the Prime Minister of Vietnam, and probably the most famous, Van Nguyen Giap, G-I-A-P. And I have later I'll show you an image of Giap, who is the military commander. Okay. Let's actually Van Nguyen Giap. Put that up there. Pham Van Dong. And Trong Chinh. Okay, and these are, along with Ho, the leading figures in the early years of the Vietnamese communist movement. Giap, of course, will become the most, probably the best known in that group. And Van Nguyen Giap is still alive, by the way. He's over 90. Yeah, he's 95. Oh, he's actually 97. My math is off. No, wait a minute. You know why I'm in history instead of math. He was born in 1912. That would make him 87, not 97, right? So, okay. Point is, he's still around. He's quite old. He's probably, besides Ho Chi Minh, the most visible symbol of the Vietnamese movement. And actually, I want to give you a little bit of background. Spend a little time talking about Van Nguyen Giap, because we will hear him time and again. I mean, outside of Ho, who is clearly the George Washington of his country, Van Nguyen Giap is probably the most prominent Vietnamese of that time as the military commander, the hero of Dien Bien Phu and whatnot. So a little bit on him. It's also interesting because within the life of Van Nguyen Giap, like within the life of Ho, you see a lot of the developments and ideas that will really move and prompt the Vietnamese Revolution. Van Nguyen Giap was born in 1912 in An Gia, which is in Quang Binh province. This is just north of the 17th parallel. It's one of the poorest areas in central Vietnam. Like Ho, though, Van Nguyen Giap's father was fairly well-to-do, fairly erudite. He was a lettre, L-E-T-T-R-E, a scholar, the French term, with prestige, although not wealth, like a college professor. Van Nguyen Giap's father was a member of many revolutionary nationalist groups, again, had the same ideology as Ho's father. At age 12, his father sent Giap to the Lycée National in Hue, which actually was founded, this is kind of ironic, again, these things get very complicated and sometimes incestuous, which had been founded by the father of Ngo Dinh Diem, who will later be on the other side in the Vietnamese War. And in fact, both Diem and Ho Chi Minh and Van Nguyen Giap all attended the same school. So they were all classmates. They probably went to reunions together, down a few beers, and talked about the good old days, right? While he was at Hue, Giap displayed a poetic idealism. He wrote poetry, and he also, and again, this is not surprising, is it, given the tradition, the litany we discussed last week of how poets and revolutionaries were often one and the same. At Hue, Giap was a poet and a revolutionary. He was a follower, like Ho, of Phan Boi Chau. And not surprisingly, if you have this resume, the local authorities are going to learn about you very quickly. And so at a very early age, Van Nguyen Giap was kind of on their list of people to look out for. You know, the police would come up and hassle him and that kind of thing. In 1926, when he was just 14 years old, Giap joined the Tan Viet Cac Meng Dong, or the Revolutionary Party for a Great Vietnam, which was kind of there were a lot of underground groups, and Giap was in one of them. In 1930, which was a year of terrible depression and famine, as we just pointed out, which is why they had all the strikes and the work stoppages and things like that, Giap participated in these demonstrations and got his first taste of prison. In the city of Nha An, the French attacked a march of 6,000 peasants, and Giap was attacked in that. He also was leading student demonstrations in Hue, and for this activity he was sentenced to 3 years in jail, but was released on good behavior after about 3 months. At that point, Giap decided to move away and stay out of trouble for a while, move away from the movement, stay out of trouble for a while, and he concentrated on his academic work. He passed the baccalaureate exam. Remember, we read that poem by Tanjay Shuang about the baccalaureate last week, which was the equivalent of a high school in some college. And then he went to Hanoi and he began law school, and he married the daughter of one of his professors. Okay? In 1936, then, he's still in school, studying law. He's fairly well established. He has a wife. And politically, things are opening a bit. We're kind of getting ahead of the game a bit now. But in 1936, there's kind of a popular front government in France. And there are some socialists in the government in France. So in Vietnam, things loosen up a bit. In fact, the French Communist Party, the PCF, even was working with the ICP, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party. And within this, Von Nguyen Giap feels like it's safe to be open. He takes, again, a far more public stance than he had before. And he befriends a young revolutionary who was recently released from the French prison of Paulo Condore, which is probably the most famous prison. In fact, in Indochine, in the movie, they'll show scenes at Paulo Condore. There he meets Pham Van Dong, and they become great friends. So they've known each other for quite some time then. And both of them, Pham Van Dong and Giap are closer than they are with Ho. Giap then got his law degree in Hanoi. He did not do well in public law, but he got among the highest scores in political economy. He was more interested in that, in the struggle, in economics, in the revolution, in class politics than he was actually in the law itself. He was thinking of going to school to work for a doctorate, which, as we all know, is a terrible mistake. Teasing, I have graduate students in here. It's a great thing to do. Plug away, keep at it. We're behind you all the way. Giap's father-in-law was willing to let him live there, to board him while he went through school, but he was broke. So what do when you're down on luck, you have no skills, and you can't do anything else? Get a job as a history teacher. Yeah. So Von Nguyen Giap got a job as a history teacher at Tan Luang High School in Hanoi. And his classes often included political harangues and polemics that had nothing to do with the subject they were talking about, but he was one of the more popular teachers in school as well. And those things are all, he's working, he's happy, he's married, life looks good, the worst days seem to be over with, but with the start of World War II, things turn ugly. Giap and his wife are both deeply involved in the movement as communists and nationalists. Remember, the Nazis take over France, and so there's a general crackdown on communism, not just in Europe, but also in the colonies. Giap and his wife and his sister-in-law get arrested. Okay, Madame Giap, his wife, was sentenced to life for conspiracy against France, and while in prison she died. And this had a huge impact on Von Nguyen Giap. His sister-in-law, Giap's sister-in-law, was guillotined at the same time. So his wife dies in prison, and his sister-in-law is beheaded. So you can well imagine what this does to him politically. It turns him clearly into a very driven man. Giap himself only escaped death by escaping from prison and making it into South China, which is not uncommon for the Vietnamese nationalists. In May of 1941, then, again, we're getting a bit ahead of the other chronology, Ho and Giap meet, and Ho Chi Minh charges him with command of the Vietnamese military forces, and this is how he's going to kind of become famous. Von Nguyen Giap will become the military commander, the kind of military George Washington of his country. And he's kind of there at the beginning as well. So along with Ho Chi Minh, Giap, Pham Van Dong, Trong Chinh, and others really do form the nucleus of the communist movement in Vietnam. I don't want to spend too much time talking about the leaders, though, because as important as these individuals were, the real key to Vietnamese independence is going to be the masses, the peasants, the people at the bottom of the social ladder who rally around their leadership, but who also often, are ahead of them, who will act even before they do. So Giap joins the movement along with these others, and in the early 1930s then, despite the French repression, there is now the nucleus of a radical movement dedicated to both national liberation, getting rid of the French, and social revolution, creating a new Vietnam in which peasants and workers tend to have rights, to have economic empowerment and things like that. The French repression, even though it clearly decimated the party, also had an unintended positive consequence for the Vietnamese. Because so many of the Vietnamese communists were in the cities. I mean, this is Marxist doctrine, right? The urban proletariat will lead the revolution. These are the people who were often wiped out. What this did was force the party to become more rural. Those people in the outlying areas tended to survive the French attacks better than the urban communists did. So the party actually tended to take on a more rural, peasant-based orientation, which in the long run actually was to its benefit. It served it well. But the numbers themselves, as you can see, as I mentioned, were catastrophic. I mean, thousands dead, tens of thousands in prison, and so forth. The 1930s, you cannot explain adequately in a short time because it's incredibly complicated. There's this kind of serpentine path there. World War II and the popular fronts and all this other kind of stuff. To try to make it somewhat simple, France, if you know anything about European history, is kind of undergoing a bunch of twists and turns at the time as to whether it will confront Hitler or ultimately collaborate with Hitler. Within the communist world, similar things are happening. The communist nations initially oppose Hitler. In fact, Stalin actually takes a stand against the Nazis far before the West does. But internally, the communists are kind of at each other's throats, which is something else the United States never really recognizes. For example, Stalin was always suspicious of Ho Chi Minh. Ho was not adequately radical or adequately hardline enough for Stalin. When Ho Chi Minh said that the Indochinese Communist Party was a loyal servant of the revolution, but didn't necessarily have to be in charge of it, Stalin thought that was absurd. Stalin believed that local communists had to lead, had to take over revolutionary activities. He did not believe that you could have this broad-based nationalist movement and include landlords and wealthier peasants and things like that. Ho Chi Minh, however, did actually. Let me go back just one very briefly. Ho Chi Minh did. Okay. So Ho Chi Minh then gets on the wrong side of Joe Stalin. He's clearly on the wrong side of the French. He's in and out of China, Hong Kong, China itself. He's a marked man. But he survives all this. He survives all this. How does he do it? Because he never lost the support of the majority of the Vietnamese people. And in large measure, he did that because he understood the crucial element in Vietnamese society, which was land. Again, whether you call this nationalist or communist doesn't really matter. What he understood was that you didn't need to teach a group of peasants about the Communist Manifesto. You didn't need to have them read Capital. You didn't need to have them understand Marx and Lenin and Engels. They didn't need to know who Rosa Luxemburg was. What they needed to know was that he was willing to get them land, because that was the key element. Vietnam is an agriculture. It's clearly a pre-industrial agricultural society. Right? It's almost it is a feudal society. Right? And in feudalism, what makes one wealthy? Land. Okay? It's not really a market economy yet. It will become one, and Vietnam will become more important. But it's essentially a feudal economy in which land is crucial. And as in any feudal system, do most people hold land? No. Only a fairly small percentage of people hold land, and they tend to be either French or those who collaborate with the French. And again, the movie Indochine really plays this up fairly well, where you see the Vietnamese collaborators and the French, who are a very small portion of society, really dominating the political economy. So Ho Chi Minh understands that, and even though he's willing to work with people who might be considered class enemies, he retains huge levels of support because he understands and emphasizes the overall organizing principle, which is land. All Vietnamese have an interest in land. Okay? Yeah.
I think 1% of the population own 50% of the land. Is that correct?
I have some numbers here. It's different in different regions, but yeah, I mean, it's not far off from that. Right. Well, actually, about 1% of the population owns 50% of the wealth today in the United States, so those numbers may not seem as, crazy as they are. But yeah, I mean, there's a massive disparity. And this is consistent from the 30s all the way through the 1960s. And again, it's something that really the Americans, the French and the Americans, never understood all that well. French landholders and the Vietnamese collaborators held vast, huge tracts of the countryside. All right, in Cochin, China, for instance, about 6,000 landlords owned over half of the entire rice acreage, and rice is, of course, the key crop. It's the key to the Vietnamese economy. It would be like cotton is to the American South before the Civil War. Another 60,000 owned over 40%. So you have about 66,000 landlords owning 90% of the land. The remaining 4.5 million Vietnamese, this is in Cochin, China, in the south, had almost no land, or the vast majority were tenants. 60%, 2.7 million, were altogether landless. So you can see this is a massive disparity where a fairly small number of families control 90% of the land, and 60% of the population is totally landless, and the rest are, for the most part, tenants and whatnot. In Tonkin, in the north, 2% of the landholders control half the rice lands, and they often employ Vietnamese as tenant farmers. Tenancy is the same as it would be in any society, as in the South, into the 19th and 20th centuries. Tenants on these rice plantations had to pay landlords about half or 2/3 of their crops as rent. Now, these are percentages that are based upon fixed amounts in a normal year, so it's not a variable amount. If you owe somebody 60%, that's 60% of X, whatever they expect to grow in a good year. Now, if there's a flood or a drought, or if credit is bad, or if the market falls, then you're going to end up paying more. In fact, real rents could reach 80 or 90%. So, you owe him, if I rent from you, I owe you 60% of X, whatever the normal yield would be, 1,000 bushels. I owe 600 bushels. Well, it's a bad year. I only get 700 bushels. That doesn't mean I owe 60% of that. I still owe you 600. So it's really a fixed rate rather than a percentage. And so Vietnamese peasants are constantly living on the margin. One sociologist wrote a book about it, compared peasants in Vietnam and elsewhere, actually, to a man who's standing in a pool of water, not knowing when the next wave is going to come up and drown him. And the Vietnamese peasantry is clearly in this situation. So when Ho Chi Minh comes in and talks about land, they respond. It makes sense. Okay? So he understands the importance, how crucial this is to Vietnamese society. Now, when I was thinking about this and putting that reader together, I decided to have you read the excerpt from Neo Tat To for that reason, because I think it speaks to some of these issues. Have you looked at that? What's going on there in that story? I think somebody sent an email in about it. It was you. Okay. What? Push the.
The concept of somebody having to sell their child.
Yeah.
And then going to and finding out that it's still not enough money, even after they've done something as wrenching as that.
Yeah. There's.
It humanizes what's up. I mean, you can sit there and have these statistics, but that story, I don't know. I mean, it was fictionalized, right? It was a story, but it was based.
It was a story based. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
To me, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Should I start over?
No, that's all right. I'll
I found it very powerful. I mean, not only just the frustrations of the Vietnamese bourgeois laughing at this woman, and then going down there and going, how can they charge me tax on my brother-in-law who's dead?
Body tax,
and
right.
they're laughing.
Right.
Don't ask
right.
me, ask the French man.
Right.
I mean,
right.
it humanized it in a way that the statistics otherwise wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly, and that is based on stuff that's actually happening. Mrs. Dow is the prelate's wife or whatever, and the woman has to bring her child there to pay for rent. Her husband's in jail for being in debt, and they take the puppies and the daughter as a servant. And then they won't, when she goes to prison to get her husband out, she has to pay for her dead brother-in-law, brother. And then at the end they charge an extra tax because she's paying in coin, right, rather than paper currency or something like that. So, I mean, this really, yeah, in a very personal way, shows what these people are against. And Ho Chi Minh understands that. And so when people say, you know, you have to have a Marxist program, or Ho says, these are, you know, Ho understands that these are real people. Incredible sensitivity to the Vietnamese, an incredible instinct about that. You know, you're dealing with people who, you know, have to sell children, or whose loved ones are in prison for debt, who own nothing. So a Marxist program is not going to do much for them. You know, Karl Marx doesn't mean a whole lot to somebody who literally is you know, going from one day to the next. And so by pitching land, he really is able to develop even further his popularity and the popularity of the movement. Okay. So by the 1930s then, I mean, I'm not suggesting that the Indo-Chinese Communist Party is anywhere near a majority of Vietnamese society, but I think it is safe to say that the majority of Vietnamese don't like the French and clearly identify Ho and his comrades as national heroes, as people who are national and class heroes who have their interest at heart. Things get quite complicated, even more so than by the late 1930s because of World War II. Wars are huge transformative events, and this was clearly the case in the 1930s. With regard to France, France has a series of Popular Front governments, but then in 1939 it's involved in war against Germany. But then what happens in 1940? I mean, the Germans come in, stun the world. Within 6 weeks they take over France and establish the government at Vichy. So France is going to crack down. I mean, clearly the Indo-Chinese dissidents, whether they be communist or nationalist, are not going to be welcome by the French government, by the Vichy government. Closer to home in Asia, the Japanese are trying to create an Asian empire, a Pacific empire. They're going to call it the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, and they foresee this as an alliance of Asian states under Japan's control. Now, the Japanese have already occupied Korea in 1914, and then China in 1937. Not full occupation. The Chinese are fighting. Well, they occupy northern China, Manchuria, which they call Manchukuo, 1931, and then in 1937 the Japanese begin a full-scale assault on the Chinese mainland, highlighted by the brutal rape of Nanking. Not highlighted, but kind of, you know, symbolized by that. And they're still trying to gain control of China. So the Japanese are engaged in this really brutal attack on other Asian states. Now, the Vietnamese look upon Japan kind of with mixed feelings. On one hand, obviously, Japan's brutal, and Japan is more brutal to other Asian states than it is toward Westerners, and that's appalling and repellent to Ho Chi Minh and people like that. But at the same time, and this goes back to Phan Boi Chau and the Travel East movement, there is something of an admiration for the Japanese because they are a powerful Asian nation who can challenge white society on its own terms. They're technologically advanced, they're modernized, they're industrialized. So there are kind of mixed feelings when the Vietnamese look at the Japanese. But clearly, nobody in Vietnam wants to see Japan continue this onslaught. And so Ho Chi Minh, Pham Van Dong, Giap, and others go to China. And quite ironically, there they train troops of the Kuomintang, the group of government soldiers led by Chiang Kai-shek, later known as Zhang Zhixi. The Chinese changed the way words are pronounced and spelled, and that's why sometimes it gets quite confusing. But it's kind of ironic, you know, Zhang and Mao Zedong would become rivals in the Civil War, yet Van Nguyen Giap and Ho Chi Minh and others are training the Kuomintang troops in the 1940s to fight against the Japanese. Ho and the Vietnamese, as much as they could be, were involved in the guerrilla war against Japan, first in China and then, of course, in Vietnam. At the same time this is happening, the French are cracking down even further in Vietnam because the Nazis have taken over Europe. And so the French crackdown means that even more Vietnamese are being thrown in prison into Con Son and Paulo Condori and places like that. Okay? So the Vietnamese are kind of at a crossroads. They have this increased French repression. The Japanese are coming at them as well. So Ho Chi Minh, in May of 1941, well, actually, even before that, spontaneous uprisings begin again. So the people are acting without leadership from above. Again, another case of that. So Ho Chi Minh is really at a crossroads. You have the French on one hand are after you. The Japanese pose a threat. The people from below are you know, emerging and calling for everybody's heads. So in May of 1941, for the first time in 30 years, Ho Chi Minh re-enters Vietnam. And in fact, it was now that he calls himself Ho Chi Minh. Up to this point, he's been going by Nguyen Ai Quoc. In 1941, he begins calling himself Ho Chi Minh, essentially meaning he who enlightens. In May of 1941, Ho and his supporters call a meeting at Pac Bo, which is along the Chinese border, and there they establish something called the Vietnam Doc Lap Dong Minh, which will be known to the world, of course, as the Viet Minh. And there we go. And at Pac Bo, they adopt the Viet Minh flag, which will be known to the world throughout the 1960s, the red flag with the yellow gold star on it. The Viet Minh, again, is a nationalist and communist movement, not unlike the Chinese Communist Party or Ho's movements throughout that. After the Viet Minh is established, Ho Chi Minh they have clandestine, they have pirate radio. Ho Chi Minh makes a major national address in which he stresses not really the communist aspects of it, but the nationalism in it. He says, intellectuals, peasants, workers, traders, and soldiers, dear compatriots, since the French were defeated by the Germans, their forces have been completely disintegrated. However, with regard to our people, they continue to plunder us pitilessly, suck our blood, and carry out a barbarous policy of all-out terrorism and massacre. Concerning their foreign policy, they bow their heads and kneel down, shamelessly cutting our land for Siam. Without a single word of protest, they heartlessly offer our interest to Japan. As a result, our people suffer under a double yoke. They serve not only as buffaloes and horses to the French invaders, but also as slaves to the Japanese plunderers. More than 20 million sons and daughters of Vietnam are resolute to do away with this slavery. Now the opportunity has come for our liberation. France itself is unable to dominate our country. As to the Japanese, on the one hand, they're bogged down in China. On the other, they're hamstrung by the British and American forces and certainly cannot use all their forces to contend with us. If our entire people are united and single-minded, we can certainly be able to smash the French and Japanese armies. Compatriots throughout the country, rise up quickly. Let us follow the heroic example of the Chinese people. Rise up quickly to organize the Association for National Salvation to fight the French and Japanese. Elders, prominent personalities. Some hundreds of years ago, when our country was endangered by the Mongolian invasion, our elders under the Tron dynasty rose up indignantly and called on their sons and daughters throughout the country to rise as one in order to kill the enemy. The elders and prominent personalities of our country should follow the example set by our forefathers in the glorious task of national salvation. Rich people, soldiers, workers, peasants, intellectuals, employees, traders, youth, and women who warmly love your country. At the present time, national liberation is the most important problem. Let us unite together. As one in mind and strength, we shall overthrow the Japanese and French and their jackals in order to save people from the situation between boiling water and boiling heat. Revolutionary fighters, the hour has struck. Raise aloft the insurrectionary banner and guide the people throughout the country to overthrow the Japanese and the French. The sacred call of the fatherland is resounding in your ears. Victory to Vietnam's revolution. Victory to the world's revolution. Yeah.
What was the relationship, if you don't mind, just briefly, between the French and the Japanese in Vietnam? I read that the collaborative government in Vietnam, the French government, was compelled to sort of give way to Japanese occupation. Was that whole scale, or did they sort of divvy up the place among each other?
The French, since they were already there and administering, basically stayed in charge as administrators. So the Japanese kind of create a larger layer. Even though the Japanese come in, was it 41, because they need oil, so they go through Indochina to try to get it, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia. France, essentially, because it's already there and has an administrative apparatus in place, sort of retains control. And as we'll see, I mean, I'll talk a little bit about this later. The Japanese, by the time they crack down, the war's almost over. By the time Japan gets effective control of Indochina.
I've also read it implied that if the French were sort of good colonial stewards, then the Japanese were far less so.
Oh, the Japanese were brutal, yeah, absolutely. And again, I mean, you know, not to downplay what the Japanese did, for example, in the war against the United States, but what the Japanese did to other Asians was far more brutal. Yeah. What's interesting about the speech by Ho, I think, is that he keeps talking about what? National salvation. The most important thing is national liberation. And he invites everybody to join, workers, traders, so on and so forth. And it's not until the very end where he says, you know, victory to the world's revolution. That has nothing to do with, you know, any kind of communist ideology. This is a national program for national liberation and national independence. And this is essentially what the Viet Minh are about, okay? And at this time, as I said, I had some photos. There's Ho's. Uh-oh, we've been having server problems today, and I'm afraid they may have struck again. I think so, because these should come up fairly quickly. These are just things I put on my own web page. Yep. Oh, well. That's what happens, isn't it? Okay. And that's why you always go to Plan B. I do have outlines here. All right. Okay. So I guess I could do like little sketches of Pham Van Dong and Von Nguyen Giap for you. Kind of like Terrence and Phillip, you know, stick figures, that kind of thing. So we're over here. Okay. You could do a little show within a show called Vo and Pham, right? Well, let's see. Well, without the images, that kind of loses its spark. But at any rate, it's also when the Viet Minh are established is when Ho more or less officially appoints Von Nguyen Giap as the military commander, and they deliberate, and it's at this point that they decide that they are going to focus on a strategy of guerrilla warfare, which is not uncommon. There is a tradition, especially in these Asian wars, of guerrilla tactics, Guerrilla, meaning little war. And guerrilla tactics, as you know, are hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, attacks on political targets or economic targets. They're not going to involve huge, big, conventional units and set-piece battles. And they understand that, you know, you can't get involved against a European power with a big army. You know, they can't compete against French technology, against the Japanese. So they're going to have to do it differently. The Japanese had occupied Indochina. They were looking for oil in the Dutch East Indies. They come in the summer of 1941. They essentially oust the French officials at the top, but the French essentially, you know, kind of because they know how to do things, stick around. And they set up a brutal administration of their own. I mean, it's just really wicked. They not only harassed, intimidated, and killed Vietnamese, but they really plundered the country so bad that millions of Vietnamese died as a result of famine. 1944-45, or like 2 million die of famine.
What was the total population of Vietnam at this time?
I'm going to go, let's see, I think it's about 20 million. But let me check on that to get make sure it's a legit figure.
Dulker puts the figure at 1 million of the Vietnamese that died of starvation. Ho Chi Minh in his victory speech puts it at 2 million.
Right.
So anywhere between 1 out of 10 and 1 out of 20 people
Right.
died in 4 years there of starvation.
Absolutely. And actually, the vast majority of them died within a fairly short period in 44 and 45. I mean, there would be just corpses. The charnel houses were overflowing. There'd be corpses all over the place along the road, just burning pyres to get rid of them. It was horrific.
Well, I mean, you'd think after experiencing something like that, obviously it would either be demoralizing or it would create a great reservoir of stamina.
Yeah. And, you know, remember we've talked before about, about the Vietnamese and that stamina and patience. I mean, that really is the lesson they take out of these things. Let's try it again. Okay. Oh, there we go. This is Von Nguyen Giap. This is, Giap is a fairly young man, probably in the 40s or 50s. This is him when he's a bit older. And as I said, he's still around today. I'm not sure what kind of health he's. Up until a few years ago, he was taking journalists and things like that as visitors. They were doing interviews with him and things like that. The picture of Pham Van Dong is actually, it's not very good. This is Pham Van Dong from the 80s. He's also still alive. He's well into his 90s. I just saw an interview with him not long ago. At the very end of the class, we'll come back to him, but Pham Van Dong is very critical of the current government of Vietnam for what he considers betraying the revolution, betraying Ho Chi Minh. So there's a picture of Pham Van Dong, obviously much older than he was at the time. And as I said, they at that point decide to conduct a strategy of guerrilla war. They are not ready to take on either the Japanese or the French armies. They just can't do it. So they advocate patience. They advocate this reservoir of a stamina, and they're quite willing to wait until their goal. Ho Chi Minh has an idea he calls the opportune moment. You wait until the opportune moment. You wait until the enemy is weakened. You let other people do your work for you. You let the Americans soften up the Japanese, and then when the opportune moment comes, you step in. Okay, so this is part of the process, part of the plan. You just develop this system of guerrilla war. Okay, so by 1941, the Viet Minh is established. Ho and Jap are determined to take their time and wait it out, but things are never easy. Things are never quite. Then turn out quite the way they were intended to be. Ho Chi Minh, in fact, in 1941, ends up in a very usual place for him, something he's very used to. He ends up in prison again. He goes back to China. Well, this time he's arrested. All right. Now, he had trained Kuomintang armies just a couple years earlier. Now the Chinese arrest him. The Chinese were a bit like Stalin. The Chinese were a bit suspicious of Ho Chi Minh. Stalin afraid that his communism was too independent. And the Chinese don't like Vietnamese. I mean, we've kind of forgotten that, or we haven't really forgotten it. I haven't really mentioned it. But remember, there's this 2 millennia history there where these people don't get along that well. And they perceive Ho's independent streak, his nationalism, as a threat. So in 1942, not 41, 42, he goes to China again. And this time he's arrested. And in addition to that, the Kuomintang Zhangjiaxi were hoping to establish a puppet government of their own in Vietnam. They wanted to get somebody in place who they could control and manipulate. So Ho Chi Minh spends 15 months in prison in China. And like all Vietnamese political prisoners and revolutionaries, he turns to poetry. And there are a whole body of prison poems by Ho Chi Minh. And again, these are quite striking. You can't imagine, at least I can't imagine, like Richard Nixon writing poems like this, or Bill Clinton, unless they were MASH notes or something like that. But Ho Chi Minh, I want to read a few of these, which I think are really quite powerful and really indicate what the Vietnamese Revolution was about. One of them is called The First Page of My Journal. I've never been very excited about poetry. In prison, there's nothing better to do. To pass the long days and distract myself, I write poems and wait for freedom. Another one, Prison Journal. It is your body that's in prison. Your spirit is not in prison. If you're going to accomplish your great task, you've got to take good care of your morale. Again, and this is really going to be crucial to the Viet Minh, this idea of morale. I mean, they believe that maintaining one's spirit is every bit as important as maintaining one's body. Another poem, The Roads of Life. It was easy to cross the mountains. It was easy to climb the peaks. The level roads on the plain turned out to be harder to travel. I met tigers in the mountains. They didn't harm me. I met a man on the plain, and he arrested me. I was a representative of the New Vietnam on a visit to the leaders of a brother nation. He's talking about going to China now. A storm like the waves of the ocean overwhelmed me. I found myself honored with a prison cell. I am an honest man with an untroubled conscience, but they suspect me of being a Chinese spy. The roads of life are always dangerous, but it is less easy to get over them now than ever. Okay? And my personal favorite of Ho Chi Minh's poems, being chained is a luxury to compete for. The chained have somewhere to sleep. The unchained haven't. The state treats me to its rice. I lodge in its palaces. Its guards take turns escorting me. Really, the honor is too great. So this is Ho Chi Minh again in this wonderful tradition of Phan Boi Chau and others like him, who kind of combines this martial spirit with this more very eloquent, and often quite beautiful sentiment about freedom and things like that. Now, after 15 months in prison, when the going gets weird, the weird turn pro. After 15 months in prison, the Chinese release Ho Chi Minh and pay him $100,000 a month to fight against the Japanese. Okay, so you could never if you were trying to diagram this, it would be impossible, right? So it's pretty weird stuff. Now, so in 1943, Ho is released from Chinese prison, decides that he will work with the Kuomintang and gets paid for it. Okay. At the same time, things in Vietnam get a little goofy. And again, Ho Chi Minh and some of his comrades have a difference of opinion. Von Nguyen Giap, while Ho was in prison, Giap and others more or less kind of not necessarily run things, but essentially set policy. And Giap and Trong Chen and Pham Van Dong are kind of more doctrinaire Marxists. Can we say that? I think we can say that safely. And they are kind of itching. They want to fight. They want to unleash the Viet Minh. By 1944, the Viet Minh claimed, and we don't know, how accurate these numbers are, and even if they claimed these numbers of soldiers, how many of them were actually armed is another question altogether. But the Viet Minh claimed to have about 500,000 troops in the 43, 44, 45. About 200,000 in Tonkin and about 150,000 each in Annam and Cochin, China. Again, one doesn't know whether those numbers are accurate, and even if they are, how many of them were armed. They're getting most of their weapons from troop. They take them from the Japanese or the French, or they buy them on the black market or things like that. Some, we'll talk later, from the American OSS actually gets involved toward the end of the war and working with the Viet Minh. But again, I'm not sure, if they have 500,000 troops, how many are actually armed is open to question, is open to debate. But Giap is pressing, he's chewing at the bit. He wants to be unleashed to go against the French and the Chinese. And Ho Chi Minh is very reluctant to do that. In fact, in July of 44, the Revolutionary Committee of the Cao Ban region votes to begin an armed struggle. And Ho Chi Minh didn't want to go that far. He agreed that the phase of peaceful revolution is behind us, but he said the time for general insurrection has not yet come. And he tells Giap to create brigades of liberation with political objectives, political ends, and political strategies rather than military. So there's clearly a gap. Again, there's this disconnection there. Ho Chi Minh in 1944, in December of 44, established then what he called the Propaganda Unit for National Liberation. And he says, and again, this speaks to this kind of debate, nationalism, communism, and so forth. Ho Chi Minh in December 44 says, the Propaganda Unit for National Liberation shows by its name that greater importance should be attached to the political side than the military side. Now, Ho wants the whole country to resist in this guerrilla struggle, and he says, we may not have strength on our side. We have no reason to simply let ourselves be crushed. Again, telling Giap, slow down, you're going too fast, it's not time yet. He leaves Giap in 1944, and as he's leaving, he looks back and says, stealth, continual stealth, never attack except by surprise. Retire before the enemy has a chance to strike back. Okay? So, and this is advice Giap, of course, will never forget. So by 1944, Ho Chi Minh is willing to wait. Essentially, he wants to see how things play out before making any huge moves. He sees that Japan is weakening. He's quite willing to let the Americans and the British finish off the Japanese so he doesn't have to. He's collaborating with American agents from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, in South China and Indochina. So he's beginning to kind of try to get a lay of the land. But at the same time, again, pressure from below is forcing his hand. The Viet Minh do begin armed combat. They establish a guerrilla force in Tonkin in the north. They also begin political organizing. More people are joining them against the Japanese. Okay? But things are never as they seem. It's still very weird. Okay? The French are still around. As I said, they know how to run Vietnam, so they never really left. And they want the Viet Minh out of the way because the French see that Japan's days are numbered too. Ho Chi Minh and the French both understand that Japan's probably going to lose the war in the Pacific. And so both of them are thinking, okay, what happens when Japan is out of the picture? Well, what does Ho Chi Minh anticipate happening once Japan is out of the picture? Independence, national sovereignty, right? What are the French imagining will happen once Japan is out of the picture? We're back in charge. We come back. We're in charge. So they want to get the Viet Minh out of the way so that when the war ends, they can restore their rule. Okay? So in March of 1945, while the Viet Minh are fighting against the Japanese, the French plan a campaign to crush Ho Chi Minh. Now, the Viet Minh were outnumbered and outgunned by the French. And had the French authorities actually gone to war against the Viet Minh, they very well may have crushed them. But On March 9th, 1945, the French attack was planned for March 12th. On March 9th, 3 days before the French attack on the Viet Minh was to have begun, the Japanese cracked down and arrest all the French authorities in Indochina. So Japan inadvertently saved the Viet Minh. Jean-Luc Couture said the gods were on Ho Chi Minh's side, and clearly they were. So again, I mean, Ho, you know, it's almost as if, I mean, the guy was either just dumb, ugly, dumb, lucky, or incredibly brilliant, right? You can play it either way you want. I mean, he, you know, was clearly incredibly patient. Everybody around him saying, we got to do this. And he's saying, wait, 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 things will take care of themselves. It's not the opportune moment yet. And boom, on March 9th, the Japanese come in and do his work for him. The Viet Minh are saved. They don't have to fire a single shot. The Japanese do it. So Japan is firmly in control, but, you know, only until August of 1945. So, ultimately, these things work to the Viet Minh advantage. Even though Japan establishes really tight control in March of 45, it doesn't even last 6 months. Okay, so yeah, again, you can't chart this. You couldn't write a script like this. Yet it worked out that way. Once the Japanese come in, Japan now, not France, is the #1 enemy of the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh gives a speech, in fact, after the crackdown, after the Japanese crackdown. It says, Japanese fascism is now the sole enemy of the Vietnamese Revolution. In consequence, the Vietnamese revolutionaries must make contact with any French group. He's willing to work with the French now, desirous of fighting the Japanese fascists. So he's looking for Viet Minh-French alliances. I mean, Jap and Trong, these guys, they're shaking their heads. This guy wants to work with the Japanese. They were going to crush us 2 days ago. Now they're Ho's best friends. The committee has decided to stage a series of local uprisings before launching the general insurrection. A directive from the committee indicates the line to be followed and courses of action best suited to this pre-insurrectional period. The formation of further units of the Army of Liberation all over the country, together with military committees, committees of liberation, and people's revolutionary committees. But the situation does not yet favor a general insurrection. So Ho wants to conduct a guerrilla war with the French now against the Japanese. People think the guy's a nut. I mean, you know, 3 more days and the French would have killed all the Viet Minh. And here's Ho saying, well, let's work with them. They don't like the French. We don't either. So it's quite incredible. So he understands, though, that Japan is weakened. And they're on their way out. And they are a greater threat. And you know, later on, he'll, in a very earthy way, describe why he's willing to work with the French. So finally, Ho Chi Minh unleashes Jap, so to speak, in mid-45, in the summer of 45. Okay? At the same time, American OSS agents are working with Ho Chi Minh. They, in fact, start arming the Viet Minh. They give them light weapons. The only provision is that they can only use them against the Japanese, not the French. And in fact, Ho Chi Minh begins associating with the OSS and helping them. As American pilots are being shot down in China, Viet Minh are rescuing them because they know the terrain better. They can operate in Asia much better. Okay? So clearly then, I mean, things are looking fairly good for the Viet Minh. In mid-1945, Japan is clearly defeated, and it's only a matter of time before they're beaten. The French, one would think, have been discredited. So it's only a matter of time before they leave. The Viet Minh and the Americans seem to have a good relationship. Ho is getting armed by the OSS. He's helping the Americans get their flyers out of China. American representatives, in fact, begin acting as intermediaries between the Viet Minh and the French. The Americans look at the Viet Minh platform and they say, that ain't so bad. One American commented on it. He said, you know, this could pass for, you know, reform, a reformist platform. The Viet Minh platform in 1945 includes universal suffrage. Everybody should vote for a parliament, representative democracy, independence within no less than 5 years and no more than 10 years. So he's not saying we demand immediate independence, 5 to 10 years. that the country's natural resources be returned to its inhabitants after making fair compensation to their present holders, and that France be given economic concessions. He's talking about nationalization of resources like Mexico did in the 30s, like other countries were doing. We should control, rubber plantations, but we'll compensate the French and we'll allow France to have concessions here. So he's not, kind of kick all the foreigners out or anything like that. And one of the other parts of the Viet Minh platform, that the sale of opium be forbidden. Ho Chi Minh had a streak of real fundamentalist morality to him as well. The Viet Minh were prohibited expressly from using drugs and committing sexual crimes as well. If a Viet Minh was found guilty of rape or drug use or something like that, the penalties could be quite harsh, including death. So Ho was quite serious about that. He believed that opium, there's a tradition in Asian society of Westerners kind of foisting opium on the people to crush them, to crush their spirits, to beat them down. And so that's part of the program as well. So the Americans are looking at that, and that doesn't seem out of line. So things are looking fairly decent. Things are looking up, in a sense, for the Viet Minh by the summer of 45. In August of 45, Japan is out of the way. Right? After Hiroshima, the Japanese are defeated, and this is now the opportune moment, or the favorable moment. The Viet Minh have a window of opportunity. Japan is defeated. The French are still weakened and somewhat discredited. So it's time now for Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh to spring into action. In the summer of 45, they're prepared for power and liberation. The Viet Minh are. All of the struggle, the famine, and the warfare, the resistance to the French and the Japanese, and so forth, seem to have paid off. Okay? In August, the Indo-Chinese Communist Party has a national meeting, and Ho then finally calls for a national insurrection. This is something many of his comrades wanted to do years earlier. Finally, because Japan is defeated and France is so weak, he finally calls for a national insurrection. Trong Chin, the party general, was put in charge of this. On August 16th, 1945, Ho Chi Minh introduced the gold star on the red background as the national flag, and he called for a countrywide rebellion. Okay? He said, at present, the Japanese army is crushed. The National Salvation Movement, he's still referring to this as a nationalist movement, the National Salvation Movement has spread to the whole country. The Viet Minh has millions of members from all social strata. In the front, our compatriots march side by side without discrimination to age, sex, religion, or fortune. Calling again on a front. Okay. The Viet Minh conduct mass rallies. They seize control of many villages at the local level. In Hanoi, the Viet Minh overthrow the Japanese. It's a bloodless coup. In late August, they travel to the Imperial Palace at Hue, where they approach Emperor Bao Dai. I haven't even mentioned him yet. Bao Dai was the last emperor of Vietnam. He had very little to do with Vietnam, however. His first language is actually French. He spent far more time on the Riviera than he did in Vietnam. He was called the Playboy Emperor. He liked to gamble. He always had 2 or 3 beautiful women surrounding him. He used to prefer platinum blondes, who he introduced as his personal secretaries. And they would ask what they do. Do they take dictation? Do they type? Do they this and that? And he'd say, "Look at them. What do they have to do?" This is a real, really sharp dresser. Always had on. All the girls say was pretty fly. That Emperor Bodai. So he's not real involved in the running of the country, and so they go up to Emperor Bao Dai, and they demand his abdication, and they kind of make him a Luca Brasi offer. You either lose your throne or we cut your head off. And so on August 25th, he formally resigned as head of state, and 4 days later, on August 29th, he invested Ho Chi Minh with the Confucian Mandate of Heaven and gave him the imperial sword and seal. The Emperor of Vietnam, Bao Dai, formally abdicates and essentially recognizes Ho Chi Minh as the new head of state. And if you want to click, you can also get a link to the actual statement, the abdication statement from, remember, this is Emperor Bao Dai, who, you know, like I said, real sharp, real slick, and would really much rather prefer being back in the Riviera at the gaming tables with all the beautiful people than running Vietnam. So he was not at all upset that he had to leave the country. I mean, that didn't really bother him all that much. And so the emperor turns over the government to Ho. It's yours now. That's fine. And this is incredibly quick. I mean, this is barely, you know, a few weeks after the Japanese surrender, not even a couple weeks after the Japanese surrender. The Viet Minh control all of Vietnam, and they gain power. I mean, Ho Chi Minh finally, after this lifetime of struggle, you know, dating back to the years prior to World War I, when he's in Paris, has national independence. And on September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh goes to the Ba Dinh Square in Hanoi, and with a crowd of perhaps 500,000 people, gives the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence, which has some really curious, really interesting messages in it, and we'll pick that up in just a minute. Okay.